All right, everyone, perhaps we should get started. It is a little bit after 3:30. I will continue to admit people as they arrive. But we have such a jam-packed schedule at ACTC this year, we might as well get used to starting and ending on time. Today is a little bit more luxurious, but tomorrow and the next few days are busy. So this is advance notice if in one of your sessions someone tells you that they need to shut down the Zoom room. Please don't be offended. We're using these rooms for a lot of different sessions, so they're telling you the truth. But anyway, welcome. We're all tired of being online, and you have decided to spend your time here with us at the Association for Core Texts and Courses. And we all at ACTC appreciate it very much. I'm Charlie Thomas. I'm the executive director of ACTC, and it is very much my pleasure to see all of you here today and to welcome you to our 2021 online conference. Who thought ACTC would ever have an online conference? But this year has held many surprises for all of us, and it is very good to see all of you and to get this show going. You know, there's no better place to start this conference than with the president of our association, Josh Parens. I've only been in the job for a few months, but I've known Josh for a while, and he has done absolutely everything in his power to support my efforts to get this conference going and to get me up to speed on this big and important job of connecting all of you and others who are committed to core education and liberal education all over the world. And increasingly, this is not a North American project with a few feelers elsewhere, but even in this room, we're welcoming people from all over the world who are committed to this work. And so thank you. And thank you, Josh, for everything that you've done to make this transition as pleasant and productive as it could possibly be. And it's been great. So I'm going to hand things over to Josh. Joshua Parens is a professor of philosophy and the dean of the Braniff Graduate School at University of Dallas. And he is also our opening plenary speaker. So welcome, Josh, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie. And welcome to all of you. So I'm going to start with a little bit of a preface. I take some risks in this speech, wandering into ground that could be called political. I do this with trepidation since I've been warned by my predecessors that ACTC is not political. As it happens, my specialty is political philosophy, though I teach in the philosophy department. But here I discuss things well outside my bailiwick, and I do not mean to insinuate anything about the political stance of ACTC. This is one of the few forays into the role of public intellectual that I've taken in my career. Please realize that I know that I'm no expert on race or climate, two manifestations of our troubles on which I will touch. One additional note about how to take this speech. Here I will be treating knowledge and ignorance almost solely with respect to the instrumental value of knowledge, even when discussing ACTC and its championing of core texts. Please know that I do not mean to suggest that core texts have merely instrumental value. As the director of the only PhD program with a required core curriculum, possibly in the world, I am very far from the belief that we study core texts merely as a part of general education or in preparation for more serious specialized inquiry. I believe in the highest powers of core texts to liberate the mind and guide us toward happiness. And now I turn to my introduction. Our times, self-doubt, and an image about ignorance. Now, as ACTC's president, I have the privilege and honor of speaking to you in this first speech of our first annual meeting since the beginning of these our troubled times. That is what I think we can all agree have been collectively the darkest hours of our lifetime. These times are the worst of times, and due to the nature of things, such times are the best of times to be in a position of power and to make speeches, because it is during such times that one can have the greatest effect and when one's words can carry the greatest weight. Just in case anyone imagines that this has all gone to my head, trust me, I have no illusions that the presidency of ACTC is that of Lincoln during the Civil War. We're in weight like the prime minister role of Winston Churchill in World War II. This is a biggish role in a tiny institution, though a worthy one. But in this, of course, size matters. Now, despite our small size, I believe that we have the power to do good, punching far above our weight class, because the greatest enemy of our time is not the Nazis faced by Churchill, nor is it even COVID-19. Rather, it is that which has most dogged the human race from the beginning, namely ignorance. It seems to me that few institutions have more to say and more to contribute to contending with and against ignorance than ACTC. I will eventually offer a few examples of good that ACTC can and is poised to do in the last part of this speech. But before we get to our treatments, remedies, or cures, I must offer first a diagnosis of ignorance in our times, and then an account of the prognosis of the patient, our nation, and indeed the world without intervention. But even before getting to the diagnosis, in good ACTC fashion, I need to borrow some thoughts about ignorance from Plato's Socrates in Republic Book 9. I have in mind Socrates' discussion of pleasure and pain, which includes, buried within it, some of the most interesting thoughts ever offered regarding ignorance. Few thinkers, if any, have had more of value to say than Plato about the link between ignorance and the sort of trouble alluded to in the title of this speech. The Book 9 discussion of pleasure and pain is the culmination of the argument against tyranny, that is, against actually becoming a tyrant. And it ends comically with the crazy calculation that the kingly life of virtue and knowledge is 729 times as pleasant as the life of the tyrant. Socrates arrives at this hyperbolic conclusion by obscuring some crucial differences, which he previously revealed very subtly between kinds of pleasure and pain. And it is only through a consideration of those differences that we will see what we need to about ignorance. The differences are between mild pleasures and pains and more intense ones. As it happens, Socrates begins with a highly abstract account of these two different kinds without examples, describing the difference as between those in which there is repose between pleasure and pain and those in which there is not any. In the latter, one is left confused about where the line between pleasure and pain is because they're so closely intertwined. Regarding the milder ones in which there is repose, eventually he gives the example of smell. Quoting from the Bloom translation, "For these, without previous pain, suddenly become extraordinarily great, and once having ceased, leave no pain behind." He continues speaking abstractly about the intense pleasures and pains, which he refers to as, quote, so-called pleasures, and within a line or so, paradoxically, just about the most and the greatest ones, end quote. And he refuses to give examples of these intense ones, other than to allude to the role of anticipation and expectation in them. Every adult human being has some awareness of the contrast he is drawing between intense and mild pleasures. And even teenagers who have been in love have some idea of the pains of anticipation associated with the intense pleasures of love. Yet Socrates avoids giving clear examples because he intends to obscure the matter. He is concerned that the erotic glaucon must needs be given an account of the virtuous life as by far the most intensely pleasurable life. To make his case, Socrates intentionally confuses the pleasures of satiating hunger and thirst among the more intense variety with the pleasures of the mind among the milder variety. That is, he describes acquiring knowledge as if it were a matter of being satiated, as the hungry and thirsty are satiated. I cannot take the time here to prove to you that Socrates intentionally confuses the two kinds of pleasures and pains to arrive at his comical calculation of just how much greater pleasure goes along with virtue and philosopher kingship. Let it suffice to say that what's important is that, sadly, the pleasures of the mind are of the milder sort. This fact and what it implies is what I digressed to discuss all this for. Let us use Socrates' analysis of pleasure, repose, and pain to unpack the significance of this claim about the pleasures of the mind to say something about the nature of ignorance. To make my point, I must look further at examples. Allow me to return to the example of smell. It isn't difficult to see that there are pleasurable and painful smells. These things are sweet or savory or the like, and those things smell putrid or off. The state of repose with respect to smell is equally obvious. It is the state we spend most of our time living in. Enter a room with some food that has gone off in the trash can. What happens over time? You grow used to the bad smell until you become oblivious to it and arrive once again at repose. With these milder pleasures and pains, repose appears to be our primary state, and perhaps most importantly, a state we can return to from a painful state unbeknownst to ourselves. A brief comparison with the pleasures of satiation connected with hunger and thirst reveals how differently these pleasures work. You arrive at the table quite hungry. You sit down to eat, feeling the pain of hunger all the while. As you fill up, you reach a point at which you should stop, but in general, human beings continue eating past the point of satiety, which means at the very same time you're experiencing the intense pleasure of eating that piece of cake, you're experiencing the pain of being too full. I should acknowledge that satiety and the pleasures of taste are not identical, but I think the point remains. Intense bodily pleasures don't have the sort of repose connected with them that the milder type do. Keeping in mind then that the pleasures of the mind are like those of smell, how might this work with the pleasures of the mind? Of these three states, the one thing that's clear is that the possession of knowledge and our sense of our own progress in wisdom is pleasurable. That it isn't as intensely pleasurable as are the pleasures of eating or those associated with love is also, I hope, obvious to most of those listening. It also seems apparent that ignorance ought to be painful. But here's the catch. It is not ignorance as such that is painful. Only ignorance of which we are aware is painful. And only it moves us to seek to know. In other words, the state of repose with respect to knowledge and ignorance is ignorance of which we are not aware. This state, much like the state of entering into a space with a bad smell, is a state that we cannot but grow used to. And it cannot but be the most common experience of our lives. Of course, the presence of this state is only intensified by the role that opinion plays in our lives, which I can merely allude to here, lest I lose sight of our quarry. Furthermore, like growing used to a bad smell, we can even grow accustomed to, forgetful of, or unaware of that which we once were aware of. Okay, the diagnosis. Finally, I leave behind our beloved Plato and turn to contemporary times. Ignorance in our times. I apologize for the length of that digression, but I hope to make good use of it in what follows. Allow me to turn finally to these our troubled times as they are related to ignorance. Plato's Socrates helps us to see why we do so badly with things that we cannot sense, perceive, or be aware of. The important examples of our times have surely already occurred to all of you. Take COVID-19. Oh, it's a hoax. Race, gender, and other forms of inequity. You mean that redlining is still going on? Climate and pollution. Come on, you can't prove that. The climate models are just too complex. We haven't had data for long enough. And the debased politics in which moderation is not prized, but condemned. Well, I'm going to steer clear of what I fear may be the more sensitive matters of COVID-19 and politics to focus on the slightly less contentious matters of inequality, especially with regard to race, and the matter of climate. Not only are these slightly less contentious, but also I can use myself as a guinea pig regarding both of them, rather than starting to point fingers at others. Now, when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, we were in the throes of an environmental crisis great enough that it drove President Richard Nixon to establish the Environmental Protection Agency. Why was it thinkable for a conservative of an old variety like Nixon to establish such an agency, while today conservative presidents often seek to take a hammer to the EPA? It was thinkable because in those years, pollution was far more obvious than it is today, not only visible in the form of particulates in the air and its accompanying smog and obvious pollution in waterways, but also quite bad smelling. Over time, I became pretty much of a radical all around. To the extent possible, I rejected autos and airplanes, striving to ride a bike, walk, or take public transportation. I could regale you with all of my other radical dabblings, including briefly attending a college where I studied things like solar and wind. Yes, way back when, in the end of the 70s. Now, I won't bore you with how, for better or worse, I shook myself out of my more radical views. Let it suffice to say that as the decades wore on and the visible evidence of pollution seemed to decrease, I grew complacent. Although there were scientists raising the alarm about climate change as early as the 80s, I would not become aware of that until the late 1990s or early 2000s. Why not? Because like nearly everyone else, I was utterly oblivious of the effects of that colorless and odorless gas, carbon dioxide. And our air and waterways were improving, at least with respect to perceptible pollutants. For those of us who are not chemists or climatologists, we were being lulled into complacency by the imperceptible nature of carbon dioxide. Of course, there is the climate itself. However, all of us have experienced enough variation in climate that it can be easy to doubt the reality of climate change, especially if we live in the continental US rather than in the far north or the far south or on an island already suffering from sea level rise. Although ignorance is not really bliss, so long as we remain unaware of our own ignorance, it is quite painless. It is this, after all, that enables all of us to lead lives satisfied with mere opinions. I don't have time to consider the effects of good versus bad opinion on the account Plato Socrates alludes to in his account of pleasure, pain, and knowledge. However, I suspect that it's obvious to everyone that if we needed knowledge like we need food, or if the acquisition of knowledge were as pleasurable as sex, then knowledge addiction would be widespread. If anyone has that ailment, something I say while being well aware of the talk of philosophy as a form of mania in Plato's Phaedrus. Let us turn from the matter of pollution and climate to consider the case of race. I grew up very well off, but with quite liberal parents. I was taught to view racism as appalling and had that view reinforced by the fact that my father is a Holocaust survivor who lost the rest of his family in Europe, and I was on the receiving end of anti-Semitic bullying as a child. Having become the radical I mentioned earlier, I attended St. John's College, one of ACTC's most devoted institutional supporters. Over time, as I already hinted, I inclined in the opposite direction to my earlier radicalism. I never dabbled in anything like conscious racism, which I qualify that way, conscious, because the existence of unconscious bias is either universal or nearly so. However, I did come of age as an academic in the end of the 80s and start of the 90s in what was the heyday of affirmative action. As most of you know, affirmative action did not have an especially long life in US higher education. There were times when I speculated to myself, and probably to a few others, that perhaps I didn't get that job I should have in academia because I am a white man. Well, these last years have revealed to me how amazingly ignorant and self-indulgent such speculations were. I was well aware that poverty had its grip on large numbers of Blacks. But not being a sociologist or well-read on the topic, I had no idea until relatively recently that practices of redlining have continued to this day, if no longer federally, then at least in banking and all sorts of other institutions. Here we have not only classic ignorance, but also a blend of ignorance and self-interest blinding me to what is now reasonably called white privilege. Though I may have been bullied by a local anti-Semite, I have never been bullied by the police, the most omnipresent emblem of our government. Contrary to earlier generations of my fellow Jews, I know little or nothing of the odds being stacked against me in a society-wide fashion. To take the case closest to home, the vanishingly small number of Blacks in higher education is surely a complex matter not limited to the actions of those in colleges and universities. And yet, it should also be overwhelmingly obvious that we in academia haven't done anywhere near what we should have to respond to the obvious injustice in the existing ordering of things. For a large variety of reasons, including most notably our own unwillingness to go out of our way to change it. There are not enough Black colleagues among us. Now, at this point, it's worth acknowledging what I suspect has crossed the minds of at least a few of you. Perhaps this is not the time for an old white male like me to be president of ACTC. My trip to this presidency started in April 2019, over a year before the tragic death of George Floyd. Had it started a year later, I'm confident I wouldn't have accepted this position. I acknowledge that I'm not ideal for this position at this moment in history and would willingly be replaced by someone with a different set of experiences than I have had. In my defense, I want to mention without naming names that when I became interim president, there was one person present who is a person of color who I personally believe would have made a better president than I, but that person wasn't available. Furthermore, our preceding president, Jane Kelly Roadheffer, chose to step down. No one asked or encouraged her to do so, just in case anyone is confused about why I'm here in this position where I am. Now, my becoming president felt a bit more like musical chairs. I was the person left standing who couldn't find a chair in time. With that in mind, I can say that I don't intend to remain president for long for the very reason that I believe ACTC would be benefited by having greater diversity at the top. If there were a move to elect a new president now, I would happily let it play out. Though given the challenges to ACTC and all our institutions that these troubled times have brought to bear, I believe that it would probably make more sense for me to remain in this position until ACTC, like the US and the world, are stabilized at least somewhat. I turn now to the prognosis. If we proceed on the current course unchecked. So here I'll turn to consider the prognosis of our world. Are things really so bad? And should they be expected to get worse? It seems to me that they are that bad. And at least in the case of climate, are likely only to get worse before they get better. Since I'm not a climatologist or a sociologist, I cannot prove to you how bad things are, nor can I even prove to you the reality of climate change or of systemic racism, except to highlight evidence that is so obvious as to be undeniable: the melting of the polar ice caps, and the constant drumbeat that is the innumerable cases of unnecessarily great force in policing leading to the death of Blacks at the hands of the police. More importantly, as a humanist, I can highlight the character of our own ignorance and underline the ways in which we deceive ourselves, despite the overwhelming evidence gathered by those who are climatologists and sociologists, evincing the reality of climate change and systemic racism. Before proceeding to our prognosis, I want to anticipate something obvious that is especially troubling about the relation of ignorance to the possibility of useful action. Often the point at which one becomes sensible or aware of the cause of which one was previously ignorant may be a point in time well past when something could have been done about it. As marvelous as knowledge of the highest things is, knowledge of the sort I'm discussing today does not guarantee success in coping with that of which one has become aware, obviously. Now, although I'm a professor of philosophy who has some reservations about some uses of the imagination, I'm also a humanist. As such, I won't shy away from using my imagination to consider likely future scenarios, which we've all heard reported on in the news media. I apologize if what follows seems hyperbolic to some. I hope that in Q&A, we won't get bogged down in disputes about this prognosis. Once again, they are merely a mixture of what I've heard and what I've imagined. And of course, I realize again, I'm not an expert. Now, regarding climate change, not only are we in for ever more drastic weather events, such as the one we recently experienced as a durable polar vortex high in the atmosphere over Texas, but also for what look to be increasing die-offs of the already diminished numbers of wild species, especially in our oceans. Not only are we poised to see massive dislocations of peoples from low-lying coastal lands, but also to feel the effects of these dislocations everywhere else in the form of large-scale refugee crises that will make the refugee crises of the last 2 decades in Europe and the US look tame. I could go on multiplying frightening scenarios we've all heard, but I'll leave it there. Let us consider the prospects of our go-to cure for all physical ills: technology. Are we on the cusp of carbon capture technology that can reverse the effects of our pouring such huge quantities of CO2 into our atmosphere? Are we on the cusp of solving the energy storage dilemma that contributes so massively to our over-reliance on fossil fuels? I can't remember the last time I heard something especially encouraging on these fronts, but perhaps some of you have. Observations like these remind me of the problem of the point of no return. And this is one of the most troublesome features of ignorance. It is all too often the case that the point at which one becomes sensible or aware of the cause of which one was previously ignorant, that one's knowledge might be of no avail. That this is at least possible seems obvious in the case of climate change, at least based on current trajectories and what it would take to respond in a timely way. If we turn from climate to the issue of race, we see a problem that at least appears at first glance to be closer to being on a human scale. Yet is it? It seems apparent to me, at least, that calls to defund the police wouldn't occur unless the evidence of the systemic problem had become relatively obvious to all but the most die-hard among us. Much like mass shootings, the evidence of some type of deep societal ill is finally evident to most of us, no matter what our personal views on gun control might be. Despite the apparently human scale of the problem, it appears that much like climate change, our problem of race shares in the kind of complexity so obvious in the matter of climate. Even more than for climate, our race problem is of very long duration and is subject to the constraints of human custom or mores. Although we live in the midst of several centuries of unprecedented upheaval and change in human customs, that very changeableness cannot but encourage some to cling to the mores that favor their advantage. I think that we all know that our recent political upheavals are due at least in part to the vague awareness that we white Americans have that our days as the majority are numbered. The depth of the sense of white privilege has come as a shock to me, perhaps especially because I can now see that I suffer from it too. I know that I had started to think that the problem of race, quote, had gotten taken care of, or that it was, quote, no longer a problem. Unfortunately, the problem of complexity also contributes to the incorrigibility of our race problem, not only in itself, but also insofar as complexity adds to our tendency to become complacent. Of course, such complexity in itself means that there are no simple and quick answers, only long and complex ones. Consequently, the problem of race will endure as a problem almost certainly not just for years, but for decades. One small reason for hope, at least for me. In the past, I had thought that it would take longer. Unfortunately, this suspicion about duration in turn also fuels complacency. Should we simply expect the problem of race to endure in the US for at least as long as it takes for whites to cease being in the majority? Like you, I've heard any number of predictions when the tipping point is likely to occur, anywhere from 20 to 40 years. Though if white supremacists would have their way, they would somehow be able to stave off the inevitable. Personally, and I suspect that most listening to this are likely to agree, I would hope that we would somehow come to terms with our problem of race before that tipping point. But this may be one of the most troubling effects of complexity. It cannot but make us doubt the significance of the action of individuals. For a couple of millennia, a rather strong teaching about human freedom predominated, though its strength was in proportion to its emphasis on stressing individual salvation. For several centuries, however, our sense of constraint as individual agents, but by what I've been calling complexity and what could otherwise be referred to as history, has grown ever more acute. Finally, I turn to treatments or cures at ACTC. Now, ACTC can contribute in many ways to overcoming the ignorance that is at the root of our troubles. Allow me to begin by enumerating just 4, and then consider them in greater depth and conclude my talk. First, we have the wealth of our cortex to draw on in ways such as I already performed in the opening of this speech. Second, in promoting ACTC and its work, our former executive director, Scott Lee, worked hard at outreach to underserved institutions and community. And today at ACTC and its board are poised to reach out with even greater institutional commitment to underserved communities through Cortex programs in community colleges and historically Black colleges and universities. Third, we are on the cusp of the internationalization of ACTC, despite some disturbing links we've seen in recent years between nativism or populism and the reading of core texts in the US and Europe. And fourth, we have recently taken up in institutes such as rejuvenating and reinventing the liberal arts, a renewed attention to the arts needed not only to become an educated person, but also to take part in a societal dialogue about the future of humanity, which I've been trying to engage you in today. I refer to arts such as grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Of course, these arts are indispensable for learning how to interpret the core text that we study in our core text programs, as well as to learn how to communicate the wisdom of these texts. Furthermore, the arts enable us not only to write speeches that might help persuade and guide society, but also to create new works and perhaps even new arts worth inclusion among the great works of humankind. Studying the arts may be the best way to begin to think about what is heretofore the greatest product of the arts broadly conceived, namely technology. In many ways, the very basis for much of our current global society, both for good and for ill. So I begin with the first, the wealth of our core texts. I want to commend ACTC in its conception of core texts and their content for refusing to draw bold lines around what does and does not qualify as a core text. Along with others, Scott Lee gave birth to ACTC in the mid-1990s, riding the wave of the wars over the canon like a very nimble surfer. He led the way by opening out the canon at ACTC rather than attempting to close or lock it down as those nativists and populists might want to. I know that our new executive director, Charlie Thomas, is equally committed to a very wide tent that positions ACTC well for the future. I think that we all now know that at least the older among us were not exposed to the entire wealth of our core text traditions, because even though it was our core text that goaded us not to limit human community to a particular race or culture, our societies have long lagged well behind the deepest insights of the greatest minds. All too often, we have not read widely enough to know what great works exist, even within our language, by authors from marginalized communities. Now, regarding the second, ACTC's outreach to underserved institutions and communities. As Scott Lee shows in his recent book, Invention, The Art of Arts, even before founding ACTC, Scott's study of different curricula brought him into deep and sustained communication regarding education with Native American tribes such as the Cherokee, as well as with HBCUs and community colleges. More recently, ACTC's board has shown itself well positioned to engage in such outreach. Roosevelt Montas, a longstanding member of ACTC's board through various initiatives of his own at Columbia, has worked in sustained ways with community colleges, bringing the Columbia core to students with little access to the riches that an expensive Ivy League education can provide. Another board member, Dave DiMatteo, is the executive dean of Miami-Dade College, one of the largest community college systems in the US. And Paige Laws, also of the board, is a retired professor and former dean of the Honors College at Norfolk State University, a historically Black university. In short, our board is well positioned to find ways to serve underserved communities, which of course include a disproportionate number of people of color. As we've seen in recent days, though our most lasting challenge in the US with respect to race is surely the oppression of Blacks, sadly, the pandemic was allowed by those who should know better to feed into racial bias and hatred against Asian Americans. Although the internationalization of ACTC is not a panacea, it cannot but help our students if we increase the exposure of those who heretofore unexposed to core text from the many different traditions that fall under the acceptably vague umbrella term Asia Asian, to have access to many different cultures and especially Asian cultures. Now, given the delicacy of the political situation in Asia, I will bracket that topic for now, except to observe that ACTC held an institute program in the summer of 2018, Global General Education in Asian Texts, as the culmination of years of increasing engagement with Asian core texts and faculty from the region. As Scott Lee describes in Invention, the Art of Arts, as executive director, he was engaged throughout the world nearly from the start of ACTC. Only now, though, have those relationships matured to the point that we're able to begin to foster the establishment of regional associations akin to ACTC in other countries. The board of ACTC now includes members of ACTC not only in the US and Canada, but also in Asia, Europe, and Latin America, who are also leaders in some cases in new regional sister organizations to ACTC, members such as Emma Cohen de Lara, European Liberal of the European Liberal Arts Initiative, and Jose Torralba, also of ELAI, but at the same time, along once again with Roosevelt, in the first stages of developing a regional organization in Latin America. Not only will the world be bettered through ACTC's influence, but also ACTC will be bettered through its access to other core text traditions, as well as the different experiences of members from different cultures and countries. Fourth and finally, the arts. The arts in which our engagement with the arts might help are both more ambitious and less, I'm sorry. I'm looking at the clock. I know I'm running out of time. I may go over so slightly, I apologize. Okay, the ways in which our engagement with the arts might help are both more ambitious and less direct. So please bear with me. With the inspiration and guidance of Scott Lee, Ben DeSmit, formerly of Carthage College, and I led an ACTC Summer Institute on the Liberal Arts, especially the Trivium, in the summer of 2019. In this two-week institute, we did not attempt to train our colleagues in grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric so much as to read exemplary works about these arts, which are not manuals. As anyone who has studied these arts can tell you, the greatest works of the greatest minds on logic, such as Aristotle's Posterior Analytics, are not quite how-to guides. Even his rhetoric is far from such a manual. But by studying important exemplars of thought regarding these arts throughout history, we were able to trace the rise and fall of arts like rhetoric. It is not by chance that we in ACTC teach much more often works on the sciences by the greatest minds than the works they wrote on the arts. The Trivium is considered preparatory, especially to the specialized philosophic sciences, but also in some ways even to the arts of number, the quadrivium. Learning to write grammatically is more preliminary than the study of Euclid's Elements. Now, the study of this history, however, leads to curious questions about what has happened to the study of the arts. Why did early modern philosophers like Bacon and Descartes engage in sustained attacks on the old logic of Aristotle? And what has taken the place of earlier forms of the Trivium? What long-term effects has the attack on logic had in our view of rhetoric? Is it by chance that logic over time has changed radically in character and that rhetoric has come to be viewed as in some respects indistinguishable from propaganda? Should we then be surprised at how often our students are poorly prepared to put together grammatically complete sentences, let alone persuasive speeches or logically coherent arguments? But what does this all have to do with the theme of my speech on our troubled times and ignorance? And how can it possibly be a remedy? In our debates about race and climate, we are dogged by rival claims about knowledge. Pre-modern thinkers would have us trust in our ability to think through our problems with the aid of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, as well as philosophy. But modern thinkers have given rise to such advances in the productive arts that would relieve man's estate by means that we now broadly label technology, that we have come at times to assume that it might hold the answers to all our problems. What is the proper relation between humanistic arts and inquiry on the one hand, and the modern arts and sciences on the other? Is there proper relation in some marriage of the old arts useful for moral reflection with the new arts rooted in newer approaches to mathematics and natural science than the quadrivium? Is there no tension between the two approaches? I realize that it would be sensible to assume that truth must not conflict with truth. Yet anyone who has studied the history of philosophy knows that little agreement exists, especially between a thinker like Aristotle on the one hand and a thinker like Bacon on the other. Our colleges and universities seem to be pulled in different directions by the specialization championed by the founders of modernity and the ancient efforts to produce a unified understanding of the whole. Far from merely throwing my hands up, I end on this strange and challenging note regarding the arts because I believe that ACTC has a great deal to offer in championing and thinking about the arts. I will conclude with an example of how this problem manifests itself. Let us consider an issue I was dogged by as my speech wore on, namely complexity. Given that complexity contributes, as I already argued earlier, to complacency, many solutions to problems such as climate change rely heavily on technology in a way that reminds one of the deus ex machina of Greek drama. It is often tempting to believe that we can rely on technology to save us. Here, complexity reappears in a different guise. The complexity not only of the problems themselves, in this case climate, but also of our social and political orders. As I alluded to at the end of the prognosis section, the kind of complexity referred to in the Federalist Papers as the enlargement of the orbit of the federal system promised the best of both small Republican states with the great defensive force of a large modern state. And so Montesquieu would teach us. As winning as that combination has been with changes in technology that Montesquieu may not have imagined, resulting in increases in food production that he likely could not have imagined, the world has increased in population to such an extent that we now live in societies of staggering complexity. That complexity in turn has left citizens feeling their relative impotence. Do we have agency, or are we merely pawns in a vast system? When we set this complexity next to the promise of technology, it is sorely tempting to simply take our hands off the tiller and have faith in technology. In other words, this kind of complexity can render us submissive not only to technology, but to our own system of government. I, for one, believe that as liberal artists, we must renew our study of the arts themselves, as well as their relation to technology and the modern sciences, if we are to have any hope of addressing our current ills. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh, for that challenging opening plenary. We still have plenty of time for Q&A. I imagine we'll have an excellent conversation about this. Just a little bit of mechanics here. Somewhere on the bottom of your Zoom screen, likely either under participants or reactions, one of your choices will be raise hand. And given the size of this group, I think we need to use that function. So if you'd like to ask Josh a question, please find that button either under participants or under reactions. I believe those are the only two places you might find it, but perhaps there are others. And raise your hand, and I'm sure Josh will be happy to take questions. If you can't find the button, just wave your hand and I can't see everyone on the screen, but I can see almost everyone on the screen. So I can try to, we can manage it that way too. Anka, did you raise your hand? Is that what that was? No? Okay. Okay.
Who's gonna blink first?
Yeah, I guess it's going to be me, but I'm happy to do that. I just didn't feel like I should insert myself so immediately in the conversation, but I will, because I have a lot of things I'd like to ask you, Josh. But maybe let's start here, because I found this account of complexity and complacency really important, and you were talking about it on a grand scale, and I guess I want to bring it down to a smaller scale, because I do, in a kind of a practical way. I'd like to talk about the theory too, but this is a pretty practical question. So I mean, this is one of the issues, and we've talked about it before in other contexts, that folks who do core education face, is that our books are very hard. You know, the books are hard, and it's important that students come to them with a sense of openness. We could talk about that as we've talked about that as a kind of reverence before, or sympathy. You know, we're not asking people to be passive or uncritical, but there is a sense in which you have to open yourself to these texts, or the complexity will overwhelm you, both as a teacher and as a student, and you won't be able to find your way in. And I do think that breeds a kind of complacency among the students, if they just feel like the things that they're reading are just too far beyond them for them to begin to make sense of what's in front of them. And so I guess I'm wondering, and this is a little bit hard, but I often think about what happens in seminars as practice for other things that we should try to do and be in the world. And I wonder if this is one of those areas that we could explore the connection between the way we comport ourselves in seminars, especially in the face of difficult books, complex arguments, and perhaps things that are only beautiful when we can attend to their complexity. I think we all know things like this. And just one last quick anecdote in the middle of my question. I've never alienated a class more quickly than when I told them I thought Spinoza's Ethics was beautiful. That was it. They just had, they couldn't find me from there. I was too far away. You know, so what do we, how can we practice this, I guess is what I want to say. How can we, I'm teaching Plato, I'm teaching Spinoza, I'm teaching whatever beautiful, important, complicated thing. I'm helping students learn not to be complacent in the face of difficult, complex things. Is there an analogy here to facing structural racism, to facing climate change, ways that the sort of habits of mind, the practices of the Cortex classroom can move us a little closer to not being complacent, to being able to face these larger societal problems that you were talking about?
Yeah, I agree, or do believe there's an analogy. It's interesting that the forms of study that have the greatest power in our society to convince are those that are simplest and most elegant and can simplify things that are extremely complicated. So the kind of love and attachment that we have to a chart that finally reduces everything to a manageable level is unfortunately very bad training for our students. I think by the time they get to us at the college level, we are in a way at square one in training them through contact with texts that are demanding and complicated to resist that temptation. Because I think probably K through 12 education, generally speaking, not all, but generally speaking, is going to be working in the opposite direction. So if we can remember that perhaps the texts, even the ideas in the texts, are especially at the most in the first years, the process of learning simply to make one's way into complicated things is probably much more important than the ideas themselves. I am, by the way, the latest person to have figured that out. I mean, I think I'm still figuring that out. I don't think yes, overall, I think your point is very, very well taken. In spite of the fact that we like the reduction of complexity that math can offer us and statistics can offer us, we need to grab a hold of core texts with all of our lives and convince students of their great value, especially for learning that nothing in life that is worth thinking about in an extended way is going to be simple. No matter how many nice tools you might use along the way to try to reduce the complexity. But it's the first thought that occurs to me. If anyone else has a thought, please have at it.
Joe, you had your hand raised and then it disappeared. Would you like to ask a question?
Well, I want to get Josh to sharpen that point a little bit, because I think I'd misunderstood what you'd said earlier, and I was going to challenge that, but you seem to have come around to the point of view that I hold, which is your injunction that complexity shouldn't beget complacency is, I think, on some level well taken, but I think I want to make things harder and more complicated for my students because I think they're very tempted to easy ideological answers.
The speech that I gave, I'm sorry to interrupt, but of course the speech that I gave was to a group largely of old white people. And I was talking about us when I was talking about complaint. I mean, I was talking about our audience. My speech was pitched to this audience, and I wasn't thinking of students. But I'm sorry for interrupting. That was rude.
No, I get it. But it seems to me we have the plea I would make is that we have a place as teachers who are not activists to place obstacles of thought in front of easily tempting action. So yes, it could be mistaken for complacency, but it could also be a somewhat different reading of the role of the liberal arts and of the teacher in our society, which is getting people to be thoughtful before they act, getting people to consider the variety of sides of a question. And our, living on the so-called Isles of the Blessed may not be such a horrible thing for that. We may simply disagree, but and I'm willing to listen, but I also am asking you reflect on the role of the teacher in this, or reflect a little further on the role of the teacher in this, in our particular time.
Okay, so your comments are well taken. I see someone on the screen who is a former student of mine. I won't call on her, but the idea of Josh Parens as an activist professor is really pretty funny, pretty laughable. But look, I mean, if I gave what felt a bit like an activist speech, it was mainly because the time we're living in, the person who I am as president. I mean, I genuinely mean what I said. I do feel awkward as president and feel, I really am convinced that less when it comes to our students than when it comes to us as adults enmeshed in various institutions. I think we need to work harder. I know I have to work harder. This was largely confessional. I am really very far from being an activist. So I don't know, I don't know if I need to say more than that in response to your, but I should say something about teaching, other than my joking observations about not being an activist. See, part of the difficulty with me is that I happen to teach in an institution where students really are not particularly activists, at least the grad students that I always teach. It's interesting. I mean, in recent days, actually, there's been a little bit of a trickle into, there's a little bit of the activism happening at the undergraduate level, but by and large, I teach in an extremely conservative institution. And for that reason, I am less aware of the experience that other people have. And maybe I should have factored that in the way in which I gave the speech. But I don't think it would be great if professors went around being activists, as I know many of our colleagues do. I'm simply trying to offer just a very slight counterweight to, I think, our historic tendency to be very staid. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, maybe I shouldn't have done it now. Maybe it was too political. If so, I'm sorry if I offended anyone. But anyway.
Michelle Rosga, you're next.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
My question is about the combination of the arts and technology that you mentioned at the end of your talk.
Yeah.
I like to think about technology a lot because I was working, well, I'm old enough to have been cognizant pre and post everything going digital. And my brother works in computers, and I like thinking about technology a lot. So my question revolves around that combination. I often think that there's sort of only two options being played out in society with arts and technology. And one is maybe the one where we want people who have an artful view of technology to work inside of it. So in other words, creating apps that help with, bird migration instead of apps, to make us look better on Zoom. And then on the other side is arts and technology sort of coming at it from the outside. So sort of using the arts as a counter pressure to having technology be the tail that wags the dog of our society. And so I'm wondering if if those two things have gone through your mind as you've thought about the combination of arts and technology, and if you would care to comment on any of that.
I have to confess that they haven't quite, and they're very interesting. I mean, I guess the former ever so slightly, just insofar as I think we all know that making humanists of people who or core text advocates. By the way, I should pause here and acknowledge a certain kind of reduction I tend to engage in, which I think a lot of folks in ACTC do. Being a humanist is not, or core texts are not limited to humanists, right? Core texts, of course, include the study of the sciences, and one has to be very careful to always remind oneself of that and remind our members that we are not only humanists. I just happen to be a humanist myself, and some people would include math and the sciences within the humanities. In some places, they're not necessarily included within them. But anyway, that's a sort of a comment I wanted to make in passing. But so I was in a way relying on that in my answer, which is why I digressed to mention it. So educating people well to think about human life and enabling them to cultivate arts of speech and thought are, I think, indispensable preparations for engaging in the development of technology, if only because we cannot hope or expect that people who are only humanists are going to be able to control those who are only mathematicians and scientists. To the extent to which these things tend to pull apart in our society over time, we surely, I think, need to encourage that there not be silos developed, but instead, above all, try to make sure that those who are engaged in the development of technology should receive some kind of a core text education. So that's a super rough answer about the former. The latter, I really don't know that I have anything to add or suggest.
We have a question from Samuel Abraham.
Yes, well, let me ask from my late night European change of topic kind of question. I'm also a publisher of a journal in English, published in English and Slovak, and I was planning to do an issue on cancel culture, but as I was, I mean, I follow it, but now as I follow it deeper and deeper, I realize it's a very, very more and more American or US issue, and then somehow detached from the rest of the universe, I guess. And I want to ask you, Josh, you mentioned white privilege, but what I observe is that it kind of jumped. And of course it jumped after 4 years of Trump and then now the trial to a white guilt, as if there was nothing in between. And I wonder who benefits from this. Would minorities benefit from that white guilt? Would anyone benefit? Would the white, those who are privileged but who feel guilty, would benefit? And I'm asking you for two reasons. Well, I'm also partially a historian, and as you know, historians don't like to touch the modernity because it's too emotionally charged. So they go back to the long way back. But I thought that we as a political philosopher, we should use enough resources from the past, from the long past, to be able to observe things that historians cannot in modernity. And I don't see it and I don't feel it, and you are not, this is not the only forum. And you know what it reminds me of? it reminds me of me growing up in communist Czechoslovakia, that whenever you either kind of fall in line or feel guilty, or otherwise you feel that you would be ostracized for saying something wrong. And one reason is, of course, that you have the rednecks in your country who say it openly and who are bigots, and they should be pointed that they are as what they are. But I don't see the space for a debate that is between that privilege and guilt. Why don't you give me some of your reflection after a year of isolation?
Yeah, I regret to say that I have heard reference to the distinction between white privilege and white guilt. I have not read anything about it to have much knowledge, sort of extended sense for, thankfully you at least said a little bit about white guilt so that I had, look, what I had in mind in referencing white privilege was only that I, as a person who grew up thinking racism was among the worst things imaginable, still obviously was inattentive to the ways in which my society has not caught up. I simply was imagining that things were a lot better than they were. I have to tell you that in the United States, simply thanks to news media, I do hear all the time about people being killed. I simply hear it all the time now. Now, was it going on before? Surely it was going on before, and I wasn't hearing about it. And I was utterly oblivious of it. I am not saying that I am a conscious racist. What I mentioned in passing about unconscious bias, you've read the studies. You know, in the United States, Black people themselves are unconsciously biased against Black people. That is a real problem. We need to know about problems like that. They need to be studied. They have real effects. So I'm sorry, I wish I had a better response on your much more refined question about white privilege and white guilt. I just haven't read enough about that. So if someone could give me sort of a quick help here so that I would understand better exactly what you were asking, but let me at least say, it's really hard for folks in Europe, I think, to appreciate our particular situation. Having had slavery, and having had of delayed effects of it that still reach into the present time. There are ways in which you cannot be aware of the problem we confront. I am as opposed to cancel culture as anybody else on this call. But I thought it would be useful to talk about these problems that I think are very real and that to some extent we just haven't talked about at ACTC because we're always talking about texts, right? It's always about the texts and nothing but the texts. But I thought it would be okay to just, for once, sorry.
We have a little bit of a queue that's developed. So let's, Scott Lee is next, and then Carl Walling, and then Michael Chiarello. So Scott?
Scott, your mic is off.
Yeah, you're muted, Scott.
Thank you, Charlie. Unmuted? Okay. An unmuted thanks, a trumpet call of thanks for that speech. I'm glad that you gave it. It was a dynamic speech and it's about things we needed to talk about. You've done terrific things as president. Everybody here should be extraordinarily appreciative of what you've gone through and done. You said nice things about me. That's always nice, but more importantly, you said nice things about, 4 really points that ACTC can use to address these problems. I guess I wanted to ask a really kind of a simple-minded question. Oh, I did want to say one thing. There is a book here. Those of you can see it. It's called Drawdown. It's really an interesting book, and it goes through a variety of solutions that both individuals and corporations can take. Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. But the question I wanted to ask you, suppose you were the king of the world for a second, and you chose to run a program at the University of Dallas, and you didn't have to consult colleagues, but you thought you could do good for the program, all that kind of thing. To institute any one of the solutions that you offered, what would you do differently? And the reason I'm asking the question is simply so that people can think not only what ACTC could do, but what they could take away and do programmatically later on.
Yeah. So I think it's pretty clear that when it comes to hiring, that one can perhaps raise questions, have debates about hiring, and raise the following clear question, clear problem. It may be that one works at an institution that is not the most prestigious institution in the world. And when you hire people, say you have a rather conservative profile, that you have some difficulty attracting folks of a different color from you who are, well, simply equal to all of the other competitors. What I have in mind is this thing that we carry away from us from affirmative action, which is, okay, affirmative action. Well, you employ it. Presumably, you only employ it when you've got 2 equal, and well, you'll favor someone who is of color. I seriously think that higher education in the United States is not likely to change its complexion very quickly unless we actually start leaning on the scales in important ways. I mean, I say this in spite of the fact that I understand the possible injustices that would result. But I do have this worry that if we don't have more faculty who are not like us, quick, that higher education is just going to start looking less and less and less relevant. I say this as someone who, I just admitted I've tended to become pretty conservative over time. Though recent years, I have to confess, have sort of pushed me in the other direction a bit. But it's a thought. It's an incoherent thought because I didn't give you.
No. I asked just for one, simply because I would like to see people think about this programmatically as well as with respect to ACTC. That's all.
Yeah.
Carl Walling, you're next on the queue.
You're muted. Okay. You're muted, Carl.
Sorry. First, I just have to say what a delight it is for me to be back at ACTC. I attended in the first years, tried to be helpful at times, got to know Charlie Thomas way back then. I had no idea when Charlie wrote me in that Josh had become president of ACTC, but Josh and I were classmates at St. John's, and we go way back. So much so that my wife was on the phone with his wife while he was giving his speech. We go way back, but we don't always agree on things, and that's cool. I couldn't hear all of what you were doing. I had to pick up a dog at the vet. But I did hear most of it, Josh, and especially the part at the end. So I want to raise a question about understanding our common humanity. You and I were at an alumni seminar led by Joe McFarland on a wonderful play that was all about recognizing common humanity, which I think is very much the spirit of the Enlightenment. And I've been thinking about the humanities as such. You made a case for them while also making a case that the humanities are not simply artsy people. And I get that. But I wonder whether there is something about the humanities that could be more strongly helpful than you suggested if they lead us to understand our common humanity. Now, I raise that question in part because of all the historical legacies in America that lead us to accentuate differences. I just wonder, if the humanities in particular are going to be helpful, whether they should be focusing more on what we have in common. Now, I raise that at an intellectual level. For what it's worth, I work for the Department of Defense, and I've been doing this stuff for a long time. And all my colleagues are just terrified and appalled by what has happened the past 4 or 5 years. And they want us to become Americans again. And many of them are thinking about national service. That's an alternative way of thinking about this. It has nothing to do with Cortex, but it has a lot to do with common humanity. Because believe me, when you sleep in a pup tent with somebody who's from a different race or gender or persuasion or whatever, and your life is on the line because it's 30 degrees below zero, you learn how to work together as part of a team. But that's sort of peripheral to all this, but we've been thinking about how do we establish a common and helpful identity. So Josh, I push you a little bit. I thought your defense of the humanities was insufficient. You didn't go far enough. That the humanities, by definition, are about understanding what it means to be a human being. And if we focus on understanding what it means to be a human being, maybe, just maybe, we have a better chance of understanding each other and not hating and fearing each other. So what do you say, Josh? I said your defense was insufficient.
Insufficient. Indefensible, even. You let that slip out there. Hey, look, so please, people do understand that I had only 45 minutes to speak, and I did not feel that it was necessary for me to talk about the first of the 4 in great depth. In fact, I even thought about simply leaving it off, right? The wealth of our core texts. Because everyone knows about the wealth of our core texts, that they do in fact stress our common humanity. My purpose in giving a speech about race and climate change was not to encourage balkanization. Samuel will appreciate balkanization, but I am certainly not interested in encouraging identity politics to the extent to which they divide us. If it were possible for us to reach a point at which we will have read widely enough so that we will have become sufficiently appreciative of all of the texts in our tradition and our language. To my mind, we can just abandon identity politics. My personal desire is that we should never have passed through the fire of identity politics. However, I mean, and I've even written pieces kind of against it. Got this ancient piece in the APSR basically that was critical of identity politics, written forever ago. I just have to say that I think that these past few years have shown us that we can't simply dispense with many of the things that people are trying to point out with identity politics. You know, I wish we could sort of just vault over it, but I fear we can't.
I'm
All right,
gonna
John.
sort of, that's right, I'm not gonna
Yeah,
let
let's
you
get-
follow up this time, Carl, sorry. You're gonna have to stick
All right.
around and follow up separately. Let me
We're
let you
gonna
know
be
where
there
we are.
later.
Yeah, we'll be here all week. Try the veal. Let me let you know where we are in time. We're about to run out of time, but we have the luxury of not having another session immediately after this. So I'd like to close the queue, but still recognize Michael and Paige to ask their questions. And then we'll probably have to end it there. So Michael, you're up.
Am I
You're still muted.
I just hit the mute button. How's that now? No?
You're good.
Yeah, you can hear me. Oh, great, great, great. I want to get back to the white privilege issue. I don't know about cancel culture. I don't really think there's such a thing. You know, there are just a few celebrated anecdotes of people being punished for bad behavior with respect to race and gender. And I think in most cases they're justified, but that's a whole other issue. I wanted to address the question that was raised by Mr. Abraham regarding the benefit of the acknowledgement of white privilege and even the sufferance of white guilt, and try to connect that to core texts, not so much to core texts, so much as to core text education and our profession and how we might serve. Seems to me, and this is specific to the US because, well, that's where my career has been. One of the things that I'm astonished by is the incredible ignorance of my students of our history, particularly with respect to race, gender, Native people, economically disadvantaged. You can go on and on and on with that kind of thing. And if you don't believe me, ask your students what the Civil War was fought over. I won't take it further. The other area of ignorance is our ignorance of what's going on in the rest of the world. You know, the fact that we don't have mass shootings in the rest of the world, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, I know that this kind of ignorance also extends to the general population, so it's no surprise that our students are in that same boat. But you know, when I address students with respect to their kind of complacency with respect to social issues, one of the answers I get is kind of a plea. You know, we can't do anything about these problems. To dwell upon the problems is to dwell upon our own impotence with respect to that, and perhaps encourage a despair. Now, how do we address that in so many words? Thank you.
Sure, yes. So part of what I had in mind with complexity, I alluded to just in passing once with the word history. the power of history, the centrality of history that has, and here I'm referring to capital H in the way in which it is used by a thinker like Hegel or Nietzsche or Heidegger. That big notion of history came into being precisely because we have lived in modern societies which confronted various religious problems, which they decided would best be solved by setting customs and mores in motion and turning away from study of the highest things and focusing more on satisfying bodily wants. That enabled the development of technology in such a way that great changes in mores and customs have occurred over the last 3 centuries or so. Things have changed at an insane clip, and they keep doing it. When you put that together with the fact of the complexity of our societies, I think it's only natural that we feel complacent. And by the way, my argument overall was not, a call to, let's go to the barricades, come on. It was simply, the fact is, the last 3 centuries or so have simply over time contributed ever more to our conviction that we have no power at all. I think this is exactly the kind of thing that ACTC needs to think about and talk about. We do it with all sorts of great texts. We talk human freedom is. I think it's really valuable to think about it in relation to technology, to try to figure out whether we have no power whatsoever. I think actually recent years have demonstrated that in fact, individuals when added up do in fact have a surprisingly amount of power. Again, it's not because I am really calling people to the barricades. I'm just I think it's really worth our thinking about these issues having to do with freedom as they relate to technology, as they relate to these fundamental problems we're facing. So I'm sorry, that was a rather roundabout answer. I don't know that I've gotten anywhere with your question. But.
We should move on to our last question now. Paige?
Josh, I wanted to thank you for the shout out to Norfolk State, the HBCU, and I want to acknowledge Michelle Rosca is also an NSU person, and glad to have her here with us. I was thinking about your remarks, and this is really more commentary than questioning, but please jump in. In some ways, what I have found over many years of teaching at a historically Black college and university, number one, I was always learning more than the students were, number one. And number two, enthusiasm trumps almost everything else. And that is not in any way to say that our students are not just as sharp as students everywhere, but there's something to be said for. I was a little sad when I heard Charlie say that your students got sad or kind of shut down when you said Spinoza was beautiful. Because I would always tell students that, whatever we were reading that week was the greatest thing ever written. It made no difference. But it was often, a mix of Black texts, white texts, very well-known texts, less well-known texts. But the issue of enthusiasm, perhaps, over complexity. Enthusiasm, you think of the rings, you remember in the Ion and the Rhapsode, that Plato, I think it is. where the, you know, the magnetism is passing through from above into the students. There's got to be a way to do this. And I wanted to encourage more outreach to the HBCUs. Scott tried nobly during his time as executive director, but let us all keep trying and bringing in more texts from different traditions. That's it. Did you have any response there, Josh?
So on the passion thing, yeah, passion. I part of the problem is I have actually too many thoughts about passion, how it became so important, why it became so important. You know, which I won't bore you with. It's interesting. What Charlie referred to, Spinoza. It turns out that Spinoza was one of the early, despite his appearing to be such an advocate for reason, there is a way in which early modern thought in general, and over time this only increased, but there's a way in which there was a kind of pivot to passion in our early modern authors that has made passions an ineradicable part of our academic lives. It's something we do need to try to sort of lasso and control and guide. But society is in many ways against us, unfortunately, because our society is awash in emotion and passion. So, oh well, I mean, we have our work cut out for us. That's all I'd say at this point.
And I'm afraid I have the unpleasant task of calling this session to an end. Please join me in whatever way you want to thank Josh for this fantastic plenary talk, for kicking off our conference, and for being president of ACTC. I particularly appreciate you, and I know a lot of others do too. So thank you, Josh. Everybody, we have a week of conference ahead of us. Tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. there is a conference on mindfulness, impermanence, and suffering in the Buddhist tradition. So if you want to get up early and talk about Buddhism, I'll be there listening to that panel. And at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, we have our next plenary session with the speaker is Jessica Hooten Wilson, and her talk is a liberating education after a season of purgatory. And we have about 35 more panels after that, and several more plenary sessions. So lots of places to meet this week, and lots of great conversations to have. I will mention one tiny other detail before I close this out, and that is we do have a space in this conference for informal conversation. In the same menu where you found agenda, you can find a space called Mingle, for lack of a better name for it, but it's just a place for informal conversation. And so if at any point in the conference you don't want to just text with someone else or set up some separate platform for conversation, if you go into the Mingle, there's opportunities to do face-to-face conversation in small groups or large groups, or I think it's pretty straightforward. So I'll see you in the Mingle, or I'll see you in other panels, but thank you for coming. And once again, thank you, Josh.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie, for all you do.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.